The air outside was cold and tainted with the caustic stink of scorched paint and burning drywall. One of the houses beside the inferno down the street was starting to catch, and the smoke was floating in thick, choking clouds. Craig held up the bat in a double-handed death grip and charged out the door, Elsie close behind him. He started to skirt around Elsie's little Fiat, and a large, shaggy-maned dog suddenly jumped out from between the Fiat and Craig's Volkswagen sedan, growling low in his throat. It was Lion, the McTavish's 5-year-old chow. Mandy had absolutely adored him. They had often rolled around together in their front yard, giggling and slobbering and grunting the afternoon away as the sun shone benignly from its lofty perch in the big, blue sky. Lion? Hey, big guy, hey, take it easy, buddy. Craig had always known Lion to be an amicable, tail-wagging sort of fella. But at some point during the course of the previous night, something had changed his demeanor entirely. The chow's body language was aggressive and rigid, the stiff-legged stance of a dog who is about to attack. Lion's eyes were normally mild and slightly sad-looking, the eyes of a good old boy living in a state of melancholy peace with the easy world around him. Now, they bulged from their sockets like twin spheres of volcanic glass, black and merciless. Lion? Elsie quavered. You stop growling. Bad boy, you... The McTavish's dog snarled at them. He reared back on his haunches, coiled to leap. There was no time to turn heel and run. Craig gasped, "Oh, fuck me," and he swung the bat hard at the dog's wide, fluffy skull. It darted aside and the bat pinged off the snow-covered blacktop, sending a little puff of powdery white into the air and a painful shiver up his forearms. The chow steamed in with snapping jaws, and Craig backpedaled, swinging the bat in front of him in swift, desperate little arcs. Shit, get back in the house! Craig bumped into Elsie hard and they both stumbled. She dropped the box of supplies. Her footing slipped and she fell onto her ass. Craig tipped over her legs, landing heavily on top of her. The only coherent thought in his head was, "Don't drop the bat, don't drop the bat, don't drop the..." Elsie shrieked, "No, bad dog!" And a split second later, the chow was on them. Craig lashed out with his foot and Lion drove his fangs deep into his upper thigh. Craig shrieked up into the sky and rammed the wide end of the bat into the top of the dog's head. Lion coughed out a strangled whine against the leg in his mouth, and he shook his head savagely. Skin and denim tore beneath the dog's fangs. Crimson droplets rained down and stained blood flowers in the snow. Craig screamed, "Oh, you bastard!" and hammered the chow a second time and then a third. The beast clamped down even harder and started dragging him back to its hiding place between their cars. He frantically pummeled at it with the bat and screamed for help. Elsie leaped up to her feet and yowled, "Let go of him, you ugly fucker!" She planted her boot into the dog's side, and he responded by giving her husband's leg another savage shake and dragging him faster. Elsie grabbed a double handful of Craig's heavy coat and began to engage the beast in a fierce tug of war. Lion gave her a wide, primal grin from around his mouthful of Craig's upper quadriceps and heaved with all his might, dragging them both several more feet through the loose, grainy snow. Craig screeched and battered away at the chow's head and neck with renewed vigor, his head buzzing with agony and panic. The leg of his jeans was soaked through with blood, warm and steaming in the sub-zero air. The dog squinted its eyes shut against the bludgeoning and kept hauling him on his ass across the driveway, almost robotic in its determination to drag him away and maul him to death. "Get off me! Get off me!" Craig dropped the bat and ripped off his thick leather gloves. He bleated, "I told you, get off!" And he drove the tips of his thumbs into the chow's slitted eye sockets, hooking his fingers deep into the mane for leverage. Lion finally released his leg and tried to shake him off, whining and yipping against the agonizing pressure. Craig held on for all he was worth and kept pushing with his thumbs until he felt the dog's eyeballs pop beneath them. The animal screeched and went wild in his hands, snapping its teeth and flailing. He rolled with the dog's head still trapped in his hands and shoved the thick-set animal beneath the Fiat's front bumper, wedging him deeper under the car with a few hard shoves with the sole of his boot. Blinded and trapped, the chow immediately descended into a writhing, snarling frenzy. In the strange and unaccustomed midday silence, the dog's howls were as loud as a wail of an air raid siren. "Oh my God, Craig!" Elsie rushed to his side and hooked her hands beneath his upper arm. Craig used the baseball bat like a crutch, and together they managed to heave him up to his feet. "The dog in front of the Jeep guy's house," he croaked. "There's more of them." Elsie shook her head. "What? I don't know what..." He pushed Elsie towards the steps and shouted, "Get in the house! Go! There'll be more of them coming!" His entire body was trembling and cold. So cold, except for the bite wound on his leg. It burned like fire. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Elsie whirled to run for the porch. She managed to take 5 steps before a matted-looking golden retriever streaked in from the front yard and latched onto the sleeve of her coat. Elsie squealed and tried to kick the animal in the chest, but it danced away and pulled her around in a circle, trying to throw her off balance. Craig lurched into the fray and brought the bat whistling down onto the dog's hindquarters. The retriever let go of Elsie's arm and turned to fight its new opponent, fangs bared to kill. Craig roared down at the snarling animal and whacked it across the head with an air-whistling blow. The dog went spinning into the dead remains of last year's flower bed and lay there, its hind legs kicking spastically at the air. 2 more dogs came racing up the driveway, a terrier mix and a bulldog. Craig shoved Elsie up the front steps and clambered stiffly after her, hopping backwards with his lips skinned back from his teeth in a grimace of agony. He yelled, "Close the door, don't let them get in," and stopped to face the dogs at the top of the steps, squaring off with them as Elsie scurried through the front door. He swung hard against their attacking jaws, and the terrier quickly succumbed, flopping bonelessly down the steps with its coal-black eyes staring at nothing. The bulldog, however, was made of sterner stuff. It stubbornly advanced against the whirling swings of the baseball bat and backed Craig across the width of the porch, tirelessly hunting for an opening. The bat felt like it weighed 50 pounds. His arms were starting to feel like old rubber bands, limp, brittle, and weak. The burst of terrified adrenaline was starting to give way to shock and blood loss. "Elsie, get ready to open the door." Craig feinted a thrust with the business end of the bat and hollered, "Now!" at the top of his lungs. It swung open just as the dog jumped away from the bat, and Craig launched himself backward through the doorway. He landed on his ass on the rough textured mat in front of the door and rolled over into a clumsy backward somersault. Elsie slammed the door shut, and the bulldog rammed into the other side. It growled and reared up to scramble at the door with its claws. "Jesus," Craig whispered. His blood was dripping onto the hallway tiles. He'd never seen so much blood in his life, and certainly never his own. The bite wound was a torn-up mess of shredded denim and mutilated flesh. Looking at it made him want to vomit. "He tried to kill us!" Craig's voice jittered up and down, like a boy in the throes of puberty. He was shaking uncontrollably. "They almost did. Honey, your leg, Jesus!" Elsie grabbed a scarf off a hook on the wall and knotted it tightly around his upper thigh. He winced at the pressure. "We have to get these pants off and clean that," she said. "It'll get infected." "They knew that we'd try to get away," Craig whispered. His face was white as a sheet. "So they're using the dogs to keep us trapped inside. They're making sure we're still around when the sun sets." Elsie peeked out the window. "There's at least 10 of them now, all different kinds of breeds. I think most of them are wearing collars. They were all someone's pets." "Not anymore. What are they doing?" "They're just pacing around the house, waiting." "We're stuck. If we go out there, they'll rip us apart." "What are we going to do?" Elsie's words were gray and hopeless. "What can we do?" "Nothing," Craig said, and he leaned up against the wall. His head was swimming. "Absolutely nothing. We're trapped." The power went out an hour before sunset, and it stayed out. Fortunately for Craig and Elsie, they'd had a fireplace installed in the living room a few years ago. Normally, it was used for a more aesthetic reason, but it did throw off a little heat. enough to make the living room tolerable. Elsie went upstairs to retrieve blankets and pillows, while Craig hunted around the kitchen for some candles. He lit a few around the living room and gave Elsie a curdled, cheerless smile. I had to turn the water off. Pipes might freeze downstairs. Elsie shrugged. She pointed to the candles and said, "Should we have these lit? I don't know if that's a good idea." "They know we're here. Would you rather sit here in the dark?" "No." "Me neither." He held up a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey. "We should drink this. I think it'll help." "But you took those codeine pills for your leg. Should you mix them like that?" "I'll be fine. Here." Elsie reached for the bottle. She took a swallow, grimaced, and then took another one. "It's gonna be a long night," Craig said. "Drink up." She braced herself and tipped the bottle back again, then made a face and coughed. Elsie pushed the bottle back into his hands, and Craig had a few good nips from it himself. The whiskey burned down his throat and lit his stomach on fire. It would warm the chill in their bones and dull their senses. It would help them cope with their awful new reality, if only for the night. They stood at the living room window and watched as the indigo blue of winter twilight deepened into the dark violet of nightfall. Sensing the imminent arrival of their horrible new masters, the dogs slunk away with their tails between their legs, seeking shelter from the sharp bite of the cold. As the stars began to wink to life in the black sky above, the new residents of Chestnut Street started floating into view. The streetlights were dark and dead, but between the moon and the guttering house fires, the street was lit up with an anemic, flickering glow. It was bright enough for Craig and Elsie to watch as they slowly gathered out front, a silent crowd of emotionless faces. Many of them were children, the sons and daughters of their neighbors. The youth of Chestnut Street would never age. They would never grow tall and confident, never graduate school and move away from the neighborhood to start families of their own. They would never evolve into the people they might have become. They belonged to the moonlight now, and in its sallow glow they would remain children forever. The ghouls moved in to form a ring around the house, and, as one, their dead voices rose up together in a chant. "Let us in, let us in, let us in, let us in." And in those words was the promise of peace. All they had to do was open the door to the mob outside, and it would all be over in a matter of seconds. All that they were, had been, and could be, all of it extinguished in a brief flash of terror and agony. And when they were reborn, they would be as one with the others. One voice, one hunger, wandering and wanting for all of eternity by the cold and indifferent light of the moon. "Do you think it hurts them?" Craig rasped. His throat felt dry and tight. "Can they still feel?" "No, they don't feel anything at all." Elsie blinked back tears. "They're not even aware of what they've become. They just are. No past, no future. Only the here and now." The chant outside went on and on, slow and deliberate, maddening. Craig and Elsie sat in front of the fireplace and drained the bottle to the last drop, mostly in silence. When the booze was gone, Elsie pulled her husband down onto the carpet and urged him to make love to her. But he couldn't do it. He tried to block everything out and focus on the moment, but it was hopeless. "I'm sorry. It's not... I can't do this." Elsie sat up and held his face between her hands. Despite the whiskey, her gaze was still clear and sharp. She said, "It doesn't matter. I love you and you know it, and that's enough." She started to say something else and started to cry instead, raining hot, bitter tears onto his shoulder. Craig held her and she let it all out. After a while, the remnants of Elsie's sobs dried to a tacky sheen on her cheeks and she drew away from him, her face stony and brooding. "It'll be okay," he said. "We'll get through this." "It won't be okay. Don't say that. Don't say anything. Just don't." When the last of the candles guttered out with a hiss and a tiny puff of smoke, the Renfrews stuffed twisted wads of Kleenex into their ears and wrapped themselves together in a cocoon of blankets by the fire. The combination of booze and sheer physical exhaustion quickly pulled Craig down into a deep, murky unconsciousness. He didn't stir when Elsie carefully wriggled out of the blankets, and he slept right through her shrill, bird-like cries as she sawed into her own wrists with a filleting knife. Craig didn't know what she'd done to herself until he literally stumbled over her body the next morning, tripping over it and landing on his hands and knees into a puddle of cold, tacky blood. He was bleary-eyed and shivering from a combination of the cold and his hangover, and for almost a full minute, he sat there in Elsie's blood, unable to believe it, incapable of believing it. But then he started to scream. The screams tore out of his throat like jagged shards of glass, and they were real. The blood on the floor was real, and Craig screamed until his voice gave out. His wailing made the dogs outside perk up their ears. They looked hopefully at the house, licking their chops and tentatively wagging their tails. They were eager for an end to their servitude to the new masters, the things that only came out at night, the things with no smell or warmth on their bodies. The new masters commanded without words, and their will was as cold and sharp as the winter air around them. Perhaps the end would come soon, and the dogs would be allowed to flee. They stared at the house with hungry eyes, and they waited. The day passed in a haze of weeping and misery. Craig opened a bottle of vodka and had mostly killed it by the time sunset rolled around. He stood in the living room window and watched them gather in front of his house, a patient mob of blank faces and burning eyes. When they were fully assembled, the crowd closed in tightly, filling every window and doorway with their bodies, demanding as one for Craig to open up and let them in. He was the last of Chestnut Street's former residents, the final remnant of an era gone by. Craig's world was only 2 days dead, but it was already long forgotten. The new residents of Chestnut Street weren't aware of yesterday, and they would never worry about tomorrow. There was only one measure of time in the new world, and that was now, this particular moment, and then the moment that follows directly after. The citizens of the new world were united by one burning, universal desire: total conformity. They would systematically root out all the hiding places of the remaining survivors from the dead era, and they would gradually wear them down with the dull, implacable logic of their three-word chant. The new world would consume what was left of the old, night after night, week after week, until there was no trace of it left. And when the feast was over, the moon would replace the sun as the champion of the sky, and the people of Chestnut Street would wander for all of eternity by its pale and cheerless glow, lost and hungry for something that they would never have the capacity to understand, trapped forever in a singular, shifting instant in time. They would drift to and fro in the dark, unsatisfied without knowing why, united as one, but all of them completely, utterly alone. There's only two possible conclusions to this story. Craig slurred and let them through the window. I can use the knife, or I can let you in. The only question is, which one is worse? He stared out at them, his former neighbors, and in their eyes he saw a uniformity that was strangely comforting. The moonlit world of the ghouls outside might be ruled by hunger, but it would also be free, in its own way. Free of doubt, free of anger or humiliation, regret, sadness. As the old world died, those afflictions would all die with it, never to exist again. Hunger's bad, sure it is, he told them. But there's worse things than hunger. My wife killed herself. I sat in the blood. It doesn't get any worse than that. Craig limped over to the front door, his breath puffing in the frigid air. He hadn't bothered to build up the fire. What was the point? The vodka kept him warm. He pulled back the chain and opened the door. They were waiting for him, a dozen of them crowding the porch, and the rest spilling down the steps and into the front yard. Let us in. Let us in. Let us in. Let us in. They waited for his response, eyes glittering in the dark. Craig wiped away his tears and stepped back from the doorway. Now or tomorrow, the next day or the next after that, it would eventually come down to either the knife or the crowd outside. And in the end, did it really matter? No, it didn't. Come in. They surged into the house in a door frame splintering blur. There was a split second of terror and doubt in Craig's heart, a flash of agony and horror, and then it was done. He rose up from the hallway floor and floated out into the moonlight to join the others. It was a new world and Craig was reborn.